All right. Hello, everybody. So welcome to this introduction to the labs, the first lab that you're going to do for this week. So everything that we're going to do for this first set of labs kind of centers around this graduated cylinder here. So if you notice, I've got two different liquids in here. I've got some water, and I just added food coloring to it so that it would stand out a little bit. And then I've got some ethanol, which is up here. All right, and as you notice, and I'm sure most of you have seen this before, but these two things are stacking on top of one another. Okay, and you guys have probably heard that this is related to this property called density. All right, so in today's lab, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what density actually is. All right, and to be able to do that, there are two other variables that we're going to have to first look at. Liquids from the very beginning. Okay, I've got my water, and the first variable that we're going to have to look at is mass. So in this first lab, and again, this is just a simulation so that you can see exactly what happened. The volume of some steel wool was doubled, right? So you can see that I've got the steel wool right out of the package right here, and then I've kind of yanked it apart right here. But what you see is that doesn't change the mass of the system, all right? And so here's what we're going to do is we're going to draw some particle diagrams of this. Particle diagrams can take you some really big places. So this is right out of the box, and I've just got some steel wool particles here, right? And we're going to assume that these little particles are like atoms of steel wool or something like that, right? And that the number of atoms represents the amount of stuff that is in there, okay? So to represent this, then when it's pulled apart, we would have like right, now I have a total number of 8 particles over here, and I have a total number of 8 particles over here, right? And that represents that the mass of these two systems is not changing. Okay, so let's look at the next slide here. So in this instance, I've got some ice over here, and I've just allowed it to melt, okay, into water. And you can see that the mass, again, does not change, right? So it remains the same. And again, we'll just draw some particles of the ice. Okay. And then we'll draw some particles of the liquid. Okay. And so you can see that there are 8 particles here and 8 particles here. So again, the mass is the same, right? So these are just representations of it to show that they are the same mass. All right, so now we've got some steel wool that is burning, right? And you may predict that when you burn steel wool that the mass of it would decrease, but actually it's combining with oxygen from the air, okay, to increase its mass. So let's draw 4 particles of of steel wool, and then we'll just represent some air particles up here, okay? And so to explain the fact that the mass has increased, we can then represent our particle diagram like this. And so now, sitting on top of the balance inside of the beaker, we have 4 total particles, okay, of steel wool, All right. Now over here we have 4 particles of steel, wool, and oxygen. Right? And so that's how we can explain that the mass has increased. All right, and then lastly, I've got a beaker and an Alka-Seltzer tablet on the balance. And then on the right-hand side, so this is the Alka-Seltzer and the tablet, and this is the, the water and the Alka-Seltzer tablet. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the Alka-Seltzer actually in the water. And one of the things that you can kind of notice there is that there's like some fizzing going on, right? And whenever we see fizzing, that usually means that there's some release of a gas. And so we can draw a particle diagram for that too, where we've got particles of water, and then we've got some sort of particles of the Alka-Seltzer. And based on this observation, we really have no idea what it is that's leaving, but what we do know is that something has left. So we'll just represent it like this, where we've got 1 particle of the Alka-Seltzer that's leaving and 1 particle of the water that's leaving inside of those bubbles. Okay, and so particle diagrams are a way that we can really represent mass. Okay. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to define what mass is. Okay, so mass is the amount of stuff, right, a substance contains. Right? We can measure mass by using a balance of some sort, right? So I was using a digital balance here. So next what we're going to look at is volume. Right? And now we're going to look at volume. And before we move on to talk about what we've actually done here, I am going to define volume. So volume, right, is the amount of space a substance occupies. All right. So now, how can we measure volume? All right, we saw how we could measure mass. How do we measure volume? So there are 2 different ways that you can measure volume. All right, one way, or 2 different units. One unit that you can use to measure volume is in milliliters. Okay, and to measure in milliliters, we use a tool that is called a graduated cylinder. Right, from the picture that we showed before, right? And it's got these markings on here so we can tell, right, what the volume of a specific liquid is, right? So if we just use this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Now, we can also, though, use a graduated cylinder to measure the volume of solids, using irregular solids, using what is called water displacement. All right. So let's say that we had an object. All right. Kind of draw an object here real quick. Okay. And let's say that we had the water level inside of our graduated cylinder filled up to 3 milliliters. Okay? And we took and we placed this object into the graduated cylinder. Okay? And let's say so now we've got that object in there. Let me kind of show that that object is in there. Okay, so the object is now inside of there, and the water level is now up to 5 milliliters. Okay. Then we can say that this change in the water level must be due to the volume of our object. And since we had an initial volume of 3 milliliters and a final volume of 5 milliliters, we could say that this irregular object caused the volume of it to change by 2 milliliters, right? And the only way to explain that is to say that that object has the volume of 2 milliliters, right? Now, let's look at another unit of measure of volume, which is the centimeter cubed. Okay, the easiest way to look at this is if you have a cube, right? So let's say that we have a cube, and so here's our cube, right? The volume is going to be equal to the length times the width times the height, right? Well, if we combine these two things, the length and the width, what we get is the area, right? So then we can say that volume is equal to the area times the height. And the reason that it's important to make that distinction is because that allows us to then solve the volume of other shapes, such as a cylinder. All right, I'm a horrible artist, so please forgive me. I don't know what the best way to make that look like a cylinder is. But anyways, so what we can do then is find the area of that, the top of the cylinder, and then measure the height, okay? And then multiply those things together, and that will give us our volume in centimeters cubed, okay? Now, here's the thing. We've now got two units for volume, centimeters cubed and milliliters. Okay, so how can we figure out what the relationship between those two are? Because what if I'm given a volume of an object or a substance in milliliters and I need to find out what its volume is in centimeters cubed? So here's what I did for my experiment up above, is that I had cylinders, just like this one right here, and I have lots and lots of different types of cylinders, right? But I have and different sizes of the cylinders, right? So I took two different types of cylinders, and I had 4 of each of those that were all different heights. And I figured out what the volume was in centimeters cubed for both of those, and I figured out what the volume of each of those were in milliliters using water displacement. Okay, so the two different types of cylinders that I had is I had some white cylinders that were PTFE, it's polytetrafluoroethylene, and then I had some purple cylinders which were polystyrene, right? And so again, you can see on both graphs, I graphed the volume in milliliters versus the volume in centimeters cubed, right? So the volume in milliliters versus the volume in centimeters cubed. Okay. And what you can see is that the relationship here is that there is 1 milliliter for every 1 centimeter cubed and 1.02 milliliters for every centimeter cubed, right? Which is 2/100ths off of this. And so then what we can say is that these two measures are equal. So the volume measurements of centimeters cubed and milliliters are equal. All right. So now we have talked about, and I'm sorry, the one important thing that I can say here is that it doesn't matter what the type of substance is, right? The white cylinder showed us a slope of 1, and the purple cylinders also showed us a slope of 1, right? So the relationship is the same no matter what type of cylinder you have. Okay, so now what we've talked about mass and we've talked about volume. Okay, so now we're going to look at to see if there's a relationship between the two. So all right. So I've got here what relationship exists between mass and volume. Okay, so we're going now back to go through the process of what I did here. So I measured the mass of an empty graduated cylinder. I then put exactly 5 milliliters of the blue liquid, water, into the graduated cylinder. All right, maybe I'll draw a quick little picture so you can see what I did here. Okay, so we'll just say that this is 5 milliliters right here. Okay, and I filled it up with 5 milliliters of water. Right. So I know what the volume of water that I have is, right? I then put that on a balance and measured the mass. Okay, so I measured the mass. Okay, step number 3, I measured the mass. Okay, I then subtracted the mass of the graduated cylinder from step 3 and recorded this as the mass of the actual water that was in there. All right, I then filled it up to 10 milliliters and did the exact same thing. Figured out what the mass of those 10 milliliters was for the water, so on and so forth. And I did that all the way up to 25 milliliters. Okay? And I plotted the mass versus the volume. I also did the same thing for the ethanol. Okay, so I measured the mass when it was at 5 milliliters. I also measured the mass when it was at 10 milliliters. Okay, and so I plotted those on a graph. Okay, and so you can see the graph of the water and the graph of the ethanol. All right, and they both have two different slopes. The slope of the water is 0.997 grams for every milliliter, and the slope of the ethanol is 0.789 grams for every milliliter. Okay, and so now you're going to have some questions that you will answer within this document. Okay, so I will share this document with you, and you'll have a few questions that you need to answer related to mass, volume, and density. Okay, so there are a total of 5 questions. So you'll have access to this document. So you'll need to download this document, answer the questions, and then submit it as the assignment for this. Thank you very much, and y'all have a wonderful day. Don't forget about this last page because there's a question on this last